Officer Danny Morrison pulled his patrol car into the parking lot of Riverside Mall and stepped out into the warm afternoon sun. He had been a cop for 15 years and thought he had seen everything this quiet Pennsylvania suburb could throw at him. The call from dispatch mentioned a disturbance near the food court involving teenagers and possible shoplifting. Nothing unusual for a Tuesday afternoon. As he walked through the main entrance, he immediately spotted a small crowd gathered near the electronics store. 2 security guards were holding a young black girl who looked about 12 years old. Her backpack lay open on the floor with books and papers scattered everywhere. The girl had tears running down her face, but her eyes showed more anger than fear. Danny pushed through the crowd of onlookers and approached the security guards. The older one, a balding man whose name tag read Pete, looked relieved to see him. The girl was struggling against their grip, her thin arms trying to pull free. Danny could see she was wearing worn sneakers and faded jeans that had been patched at the knees. Her hair was pulled back in 2 neat braids, and despite the tears, she held her head high. Pete immediately started talking before Danny could even ask what happened. He explained that they caught the girl stealing from the electronics store about 20 minutes ago. According to Pete, she had a tablet hidden in her backpack that belonged to the store. The display model had gone missing that morning, and when they checked her bag during a routine security sweep, they found it. The serial numbers matched their inventory records. Danny looked down at the girl and then at the tablet that Pete was holding. It was a high-end model, sleek and expensive, probably worth around $800 or more. He had seen cases like this before, kids stealing things they could not afford, thinking they would not get caught. The girl immediately started protesting, her voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. She insisted that she did not steal anything and that the tablet belonged to her. Her mother had given it to her as a birthday present 6 weeks ago. She kept repeating that it was hers, that she had done nothing wrong, and that they needed to call her mom right away. Danny knelt down to be at eye level with her and spoke in what he thought was a calm and reasonable tone. He asked her if she had a receipt for the tablet. The girl said the receipt was at home. Danny glanced at Pete, who shook his head and repeated that their inventory showed a tablet missing, and the serial numbers were a perfect match. Danny stood back up and looked at the expensive device again, then at the girl's worn clothing. Something did not add up, but he had learned over the years that kids often made up elaborate stories when caught doing something wrong. The girl suddenly shouted that they needed to call her mother right now. She said her mom would explain everything and prove that the tablet was really hers. Then she said something that made Danny pause. She claimed her mother was in special forces and that when she arrived, everyone was going to be in serious trouble. Her voice was filled with certainty and anger, as if she truly believed what she was saying. Danny could not help the small smile that crossed his face. Several people in the crowd chuckled quietly. Special forces seemed like an odd thing for a kid to make up, but he had heard stranger stories from children trying to get out of trouble. He had once dealt with a kid who claimed his father was the president's personal bodyguard. Another time, a teenager insisted her mother was a secret agent for the FBI. It was always something dramatic and impressive. The girl noticed his smile and her face flushed with anger. She insisted she was telling the truth. Her mother's name was Lieutenant Maya Carter, and she worked for something called the Earth Defense Coalition Orbital Operations. The words came out in a rush, as if she had said them many times before and was frustrated that no one ever believed her. Danny actually laughed at that. Earth Defense Coalition sounded like something straight out of a science fiction movie. He had never heard of any military unit with that name. Orbital operations made it even more ridiculous. He figured the girl had been watching too much television or playing too many video games. Pete and the other security guard exchanged glances that clearly said they thought the same thing. The girl's name was Kenya Carter, and she was now looking at Danny with an expression that mixed anger, frustration, and something else he could not quite identify. It almost looked like disappointment. She kept insisting that she was telling the truth and demanded that someone call her mother. She said if they would just make one phone call, everything would be cleared up. Danny sighed and decided to try a different approach. He asked Kenya to calm down and tell him the real story about where her parents were. He used his most patient voice, the one he reserved for dealing with kids who were scared and making bad choices. He told her that lying would only make things worse and that he wanted to help her, but she needed to be honest with him. Kenya's expression hardened and she stared directly into his eyes. She repeated that her name was Kenya Carter, that her mother was Lieutenant Maya Carter of the Earth Defense Coalition, and that she was telling the absolute truth. She asked again for someone to call the number in her phone. Her voice had stopped shaking, and she spoke with a confidence that seemed unusual for someone her age who was being accused of theft. Danny found himself actually considering it for a moment. The girl seemed genuinely convinced of what she was saying. But then he reminded himself that kids could be very good at believing their own stories, especially when they were in trouble. He had seen it countless times. They would create elaborate fantasies and convince themselves they were real. He looked at Kenya and asked her to try again and tell him where her parents really were. He said he understood she was scared, but making up stories about special forces and space operations was not going to help her situation. The crowd around them had grown larger, and Danny was aware that several people had their phones out, probably recording the whole scene. Danny looked at the frustrated girl in front of him and made a decision. Sometimes the best way to get through to a kid who was telling stories was to let them play it out. Once the call went nowhere or reached some confused relative, maybe then Kenya would be ready to tell him the truth about what really happened. He bent down and picked up her phone from among the scattered belongings on the floor. The screen was cracked in one corner but still worked. He held it out to her and told her to go ahead and call her mother. His tone made it clear he expected this to go nowhere. Kenya's hands were shaking as she took the phone from him. She scrolled through her contacts with trembling fingers, and Danny noticed that despite her obvious fear and anger, she moved with purpose. She knew exactly what she was looking for. She pressed a contact labeled Mom and held the phone to her ear. Danny watched her face carefully, already preparing his next set of questions for when this call ended with a confused grandmother or disconnected number. The phone rang once in the quiet that had fallen over the crowd. Then it rang a second time. Danny was about to suggest they try a different number when someone answered. Even from where he stood, Danny could hear that the voice on the other end was crisp and professional, like someone answering a business call. Kenya's voice immediately cracked with emotion as she spoke. She told her mom that she needed her right away. She explained that she was at Riverside Mall and that the security guards thought she had stolen her tablet. She said the police were there and nobody would believe her. Her voice broke on the last word, and fresh tears started running down her face. Danny heard the voice on the other end of the phone change instantly. It went from professional to sharp and commanding in less than a second. Even though he could not make out the exact words, he could hear the tone shift to something that made him straighten up unconsciously. Kenya held out the phone toward him and said that her mother wanted to talk to him. Danny took the phone, still skeptical but now feeling the first small hint of uncertainty. He identified himself as Officer Morrison with the Riverside Police Department and asked who he was speaking with. The woman on the other end spoke clearly and with unmistakable authority. She identified herself as Lieutenant Maya Carter of the Earth Defense Coalition, Orbital Drop Division. She asked in a tone that expected an immediate answer what exactly was happening at the mall. Danny explained that Kenya had been found with stolen merchandise and that they were trying to sort out the situation. He kept his voice professional, but he was starting to feel off balance. The woman spoke with the kind of command presence he usually only heard from senior military officers or federal agents. Maya told him in no uncertain terms that the tablet was not stolen. She said she had purchased it for Kenya 6 weeks ago from a store called Miller Electronics in downtown Pittsburgh. She stated that she had the receipt in her home office along with the original packaging and warranty documentation. Then she did something that made Danny blink in surprise. She recited the serial number from memory, including a mix of letters and numbers that would have been impossible to make up on the spot. Danny looked down at the tablet in Pete's hands and could see the serial number sticker, but he could not verify if it matched without checking. Maya was still talking, and her voice had dropped several degrees in temperature. She asked Danny how she could prove who she was. Danny felt like he was losing control of the situation, which was not a feeling he enjoyed. He replied that with all respect he needed some way to verify her identity. Anyone could claim to be military or law enforcement over the phone. There was a pause on the line, and when Maya spoke again, Danny actually felt a chill run down his spine. She told him that she was currently on leave from active duty. She gave her home address as 4725 Elmwood Drive and said he could verify it was her registered address. Then she suggested, in a way that was clearly not really a suggestion, that he run her name through his system. She said he would find that she had federal clearance level 7. Danny did not know much about federal clearance levels, but he knew that 7 was extremely high. That was above most FBI agents he had ever dealt with. Maya continued speaking, and her voice now carried an edge that made it clear she was done being patient. She said that in the meantime, her daughter had better not have a single scratch on her when she arrived. She stated that she would be at the mall in 12 minutes, and then the line went dead. Danny stood there holding the phone and staring at it like it might suddenly provide answers. Kenya was watching him with an expression that mixed hope and vindication. She knew something had shifted in how he was viewing the situation. Pete asked what the mother had said, but Danny held up a hand to silence him. He needed to think. He handed the phone back to Kenya and told Pete to watch her for a minute. Then he walked quickly toward his patrol car, pulling his radio from his belt as he went. He needed to call dispatch and run this woman's name. If she was who she claimed to be, this whole situation was about to become much more complicated. If she was not, then at least he would know they were dealing with someone who was very good at sounding official. Either way, Danny had a bad feeling settling in his stomach. The confidence in Kenya's face when he handed back her phone told him that she absolutely believed her mother was coming. That kind of certainty was hard to fake, especially for a 12-year-old girl who had just been accused of theft. Danny reached his patrol car and slid into the driver's seat. He pressed the button on his radio and called dispatch. His dispatcher, Linda, answered immediately, and Danny asked her to run a name for him. He spelled out Maya Carter and gave the address she had provided. Linda asked what this was about, and Danny told her to just run the name, please. There was a pause, and then Linda came back on the radio. Her voice sounded confused, which was unusual because Linda had been doing this job for 20 years and rarely sounded uncertain about anything. Linda came back on the radio with information that made Danny's stomach sink even further. She confirmed that there was a Maya Carter at the address he provided, but when she tried to pull up more details, something strange happened. The system blocked her access. Linda explained that she was getting a message saying she needed authorization level 6 or higher to view the file. In her 20 years of dispatch work, she had never seen anything like this for a regular citizen. Danny asked her what she meant by blocked, and Linda explained that Maya Carter's records were classified. The only information visible was that she held active federal credentials, and there was a flag in the system. The flag instructed anyone making inquiries about her to contact the Department of Defense directly. Linda's voice carried a tone of concern that Danny rarely heard from her. She asked him who this woman was and what he had gotten into. Danny explained that she claimed to be with something called the Earth Defense Coalition, Orbital Drop Division. The words sounded even stranger saying them out loud to dispatch than they had when Kenya first said them. Linda was quiet for a moment, and Danny could hear her typing in the background. Then she told him to hold on because she was transferring him to Sergeant Palmer. Danny felt his pulse quicken. Palmer was his direct supervisor and not someone who got involved in routine shoplifting cases. The fact that Linda was pulling him into this meant something serious was happening. The line clicked and Palmer's voice came through, sharp and demanding to know what Danny had gotten himself into. Danny quickly explained the situation from the beginning. He talked about the shoplifting accusation, the girl claiming her mother was military, and now dispatch saying the mother's records were classified. He tried to keep his voice calm and professional, but he could hear the uncertainty creeping into his own words. Palmer listened without interrupting, which was never a good sign. When Danny finished, Palmer was quiet for several long seconds. Then he told Danny something that made his blood run cold. Palmer said he had just received a call from a colonel at Harrisburg. The colonel wanted to know why Riverside police were detaining the daughter of one of his officers. The colonel had been very clear, Palmer said, that they needed to treat this situation with extreme care. Palmer's voice carried a mixture of irritation and concern. He asked Danny again what was going on, and there was an implication in his tone that Danny had better have a good answer. Danny went through the details again, more carefully this time. He explained about the tablet, the matching serial number that Pete claimed to have verified, and Kenya's insistence that it belonged to her. He mentioned how he had initially dismissed her claims about her mother because they sounded so unlikely. Palmer cut him off and gave him direct orders. Danny was to wait for the mother to arrive. He was to be exceptionally polite. He was to let her sort this out. Most importantly, Palmer emphasized, Danny was not to arrest Kenya unless he had absolute proof of theft. The way Palmer stressed the word absolute made it clear that he considered the current evidence insufficient. Palmer added that if this situation went sideways, it would be Danny's career on the line. Danny acknowledged the orders and ended the call. He sat in his patrol car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and trying to process what was happening. A routine shoplifting call had somehow turned into a situation involving classified records and calls from colonels. He thought about Kenya's face when she told him about her mother. The girl had been absolutely certain, not in the way kids were when they made up stories, but in the way people were when they knew something to be true. Danny got out of the car and walked back to where Kenya sat on a bench. Pete had gathered her belongings and put them in a neat pile next to her. The crowd had thinned somewhat, but there were still plenty of people watching and recording on their phones. Danny knew this was probably already spreading on social media. He approached Kenya and told her in a much softer tone than before that her mother would be arriving soon. Kenya looked up at him and simply said that she had told him so. There was no smugness in her voice, just a statement of fact. Danny found himself looking at her differently now. He noticed details he had missed before. Her clothes might be worn, but they were clean and carefully maintained. Her backpack, despite being old, was organized with her schoolwork neatly arranged in folders. Her fingernails were trimmed and clean. These were not the signs of a neglected child or a troublemaker. These were the signs of a kid who took care of her things and followed rules. He asked Kenya if she wanted some water while they waited. She shook her head but thanked him politely. The courtesy in her response made him feel even worse about how he had initially handled this. Pete approached Danny and asked quietly what was going on. The security guard seemed nervous now, perhaps sensing that this was not playing out the way he expected. Danny told him they were waiting for the mother to arrive and that they would sort everything out then. He suggested that Pete might want to double-check the serial number verification he had done. Pete's face went a shade paler and he hurried back toward the electronics store. Danny pulled out his own phone and did a quick search for Earth Defense Coalition. To his surprise, actual results came up. There were official government websites with minimal information, mostly recruiting pages and vague descriptions of orbital defense operations. The details were sparse, but the organizations clearly existed. He found references to something called the Orbital Drop Division, though most of the information was marked as classified or restricted. There were a few news articles from several years ago about expanded military operations in space, but they were brief and light on specifics. Danny felt foolish. The girl had been telling the truth and he had laughed at her. He had made assumptions based on what he thought was possible, rather than checking the facts. It was a basic mistake, the kind they taught you not to make in the police academy. He looked at his watch and realized that 11 minutes had passed since the phone call ended. Maya Carter had said she would be there in 12 minutes. Danny found himself both dreading and curious about her arrival. He wondered what kind of person could have records classified at such a high level. He wondered what Orbital Drop Division actually meant. Most of all, he wondered how he was going to explain to this woman why he had dismissed her daughter's truthful statements as fantasy. The atmosphere in the mall had changed. Danny could feel it even before he saw anything. It was like the air pressure dropping before a storm. Several people near the main entrance turned to look at something, and the remaining crowd began to part like water flowing around a rock. Maya Carter walked through the mall entrance exactly 11 minutes and 30 seconds after the phone call ended. Danny knew it was her before anyone said a word. She moved with a precision and purpose that made everyone instinctively step aside. She stood about 5'9" with a lean and powerful build that came from years of serious physical training. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a dark jacket. But there was nothing civilian about the way she carried herself. Every movement was controlled and efficient, like someone who had trained their body to respond instantly to their commands. But what made Danny's mouth go dry was not Maya herself. It was the people who came in behind her. 2 men in dark suits flanked her on either side, moving with the same controlled grace. They wore earpieces, and Danny could see the unmistakable bulge of sidearms under their jackets. Behind them walked a woman in an actual military uniform, wearing insignia that Danny did not recognize. She carried a briefcase and moved with the same military bearing as Maya. The small group swept through the mall like a tactical unit, and Danny suddenly understood that Kenya had not been exaggerating at all. If anything, she had undersold the situation. Maya's eyes found her daughter immediately. She asked in a voice that carried clearly across the space if Kenya was hurt. There was concern in her tone, but also an underlying current of controlled anger. Kenya stood up from the bench and told her mom she was fine. She started to explain what she had told the security guards, but Maya held up a hand. She said she knew what Kenya had told them. calling her baby in a way that was both affectionate and reassuring. Then Maya's gaze shifted to Danny, and he felt pinned in place by the intensity of her stare. She asked if he was Officer Morrison, and he confirmed that he was. His voice came out steadier than he felt, which he considered a small victory. Maya asked where the store manager was who had accused her daughter. Pete stepped forward nervously. He was clearly intimidated by the entire scene unfolding in front of him. He identified himself as the head of security for the mall. Maya turned to the woman in uniform and addressed her as Captain Rodriguez. She asked for the documentation in a tone that made it clear this had all been prepared in advance. Captain Rodriguez opened the briefcase with crisp efficiency and removed several papers. She handed them to Maya, who then passed them directly to Pete. Maya explained what each document was as Pete looked at them with increasingly pale face. There was the purchase receipt dated 6 weeks ago from the exact store she had mentioned. There was warranty registration in her name, and there was serial number verification from the manufacturer, which Maya said she had them emailed during her drive to the mall. Pete examined the papers, and Danny could see his hands shaking slightly. He admitted that the documents looked legitimate. Maya's response was delivered in a voice that could have cut through steel. She said the documents were legitimate because her daughter had been telling the truth from the beginning. Then she asked a question that made everyone in the vicinity uncomfortable. She wanted to know why. When a 12-year-old girl told them the tablet was hers, their first instinct had been to call her a thief, rather than verify her claim. Danny felt compelled to step forward and defend their actions. He said that in fairness, they were just doing their jobs. He started to explain about the serial number matching, but Maya cut him off by shifting her full attention to him. She spoke in a way that made it clear she was barely holding back her anger. She said she had spent 8 years in orbital deployment zones fighting to keep Earth safe. She had lost friends in the vacuum of space. She had made decisions that cost lives in order to save millions more. She told Danny that she had not done all of that so her daughter could be humiliated in a shopping mall because someone could not be bothered to do basic verification before detaining a child. One of the suited men, standing slightly behind Maya, leaned close and quietly suggested that they should probably move on. He called her lieutenant and seemed to be trying to de-escalate the situation. Maya held up her hand to stop him and said she was not done. She addressed him as Agent Phillips but kept her eyes on Danny. She returned to her point about Kenya telling them exactly who she was and exactly what to do. Instead of listening to her daughter, Maya said, Danny had laughed at her. She asked if he understood how that looked from where she was standing. Danny felt heat rising in his face. He tried to explain that they got false stories from kids all the time, but Maya interrupted him again. She said she did not have to understand anything. What she understood was that her daughter, a straight-A student who had never been in trouble in her life, had been treated like a criminal. What she understood was that Kenya had given him a way to verify her story, and he had chosen mockery instead. The words hit Danny harder than he expected because he knew they were true. He had made a choice in that moment to dismiss Kenya, rather than take 5 minutes to verify what she was saying. He had let his assumptions about what was possible override the simple step of checking the facts. The crowd had grown quiet, and Danny was acutely aware that many people were recording this entire exchange. This was going to follow him for a long time. Maya's expression had not softened at all. She stood between Danny and her daughter like a barrier, and her body language made it clear she was ready to escalate this situation much further if needed. The 2 agents flanking her had not moved or spoken, but their presence added weight to every word Maya said. Captain Rodriguez stood slightly to the side, holding the briefcase and watching everything with a neutral expression that suggested she had seen Maya handle difficult situations before. Pete had backed away and looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. The papers Maya had given him hung limply in his hands. The tense silence was broken by a nervous voice from behind the gathered crowd. A young man who could not have been more than 25 pushed through the onlookers. He wore the electronics store uniform and a name tag that identified him as Craig. His face was flushed, and he was holding a tablet in his hands. He looked absolutely terrified of what he was about to say. Craig apologized for interrupting and said he thought he had made a mistake. His voice was quiet and shaky, but in the silence that had fallen over the mall, everyone could hear him clearly. All eyes turned to him, and he seemed to shrink under the attention. Maya's gaze fixed on him with laser focus, and he swallowed hard before continuing. Craig explained that he had been doing inventory that morning, and marked a tablet as missing from their stock. But he had just rechecked their stockroom after hearing about the situation, and he found the tablet. It had been placed in the wrong storage bin by another employee. Then Craig said something that made the entire situation crash down around them. He admitted that the serial number he had given to security was wrong. He had transposed 2 of the digits when he wrote it down. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Pete's face went from pale to crimson in seconds. Danny felt something cold and heavy settle in his chest like a stone dropping into water. The crowd began to murmur, and the sound grew louder as people realized what this meant. Craig looked like he wanted to cry. He kept apologizing, saying he was really sorry over and over. His hands were shaking as he held the tablet that should have been accounted for all along. Maya's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. Her voice was deadly calm when she spoke. She asked Craig to confirm that he was saying her daughter had been detained, accused of theft and humiliated because of a clerical error. Craig nodded miserably and apologized again. Kenya stood up from the bench where she had been sitting. Her voice shook with emotion as she spoke. She said that she had told them the tablet was hers. She had told them her mom gave it to her. She asked why nobody had believed her. The question hung in the air, and no one seemed to have a good answer. Maya moved to her daughter and placed a protective hand on Kenya's shoulder. She told Kenya that sometimes people made assumptions. Sometimes they saw what they expected to see instead of what was really there. Her voice was gentle when speaking to her daughter, but when she looked back at the adults who had been involved, her expression hardened again. Danny knew he needed to say something, but what could he possibly say that would make this better? The girl had been right about everything from the start. Her mother was exactly who she claimed to be. The tablet was exactly what Kenya said it was, and he had laughed at her for telling the truth. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward and quietly suggested to Maya that perhaps they should discuss next steps privately. Maya nodded slowly but kept her attention on Danny. She told him she was going to need his badge number and the name of his commanding officer. Danny felt his career flashing before his eyes, but he knew he deserved whatever was coming. He started to say that he understood she was upset, but Maya cut him off immediately. She asked if he thought she was just upset. Her laugh was sharp and bitter. She told him that upset was what she felt when someone cut her off in traffic. This was different. This was watching her child learn that telling the truth did not matter if the people in authority did not want to listen. She asked Danny if he had any idea what kind of lesson that was for a 12-year-old. Agent Phillips, one of the suited men who had come with Maya, spoke up for the first time. He said that for what it was worth, he thought Officer Morrison had been doing what he thought was right given the information he had. It was a generous assessment, and Danny appreciated the attempt to defuse the situation, but he knew it was not enough. Maya looked at Agent Phillips and told him respectfully that it was not good enough. She said the information Danny needed had been right in front of him. He had chosen not to use it. She emphasized the word chosen in a way that made it clear she held him responsible for his decisions. Danny felt compelled to defend himself even though he knew it was probably a mistake. He said that in his defense they received false claims all the time. Kids made up stories about parents being doctors, lawyers, and politicians. He was trying to explain that skepticism was part of the job. But even as the words came out, he realized how weak they sounded. Maya seized on his statement immediately. She asked if a child told him their parent was a doctor. Would he refuse to call and verify? Would he laugh at them? Her eyes bored into him as she asked the next question. She wanted to know if it was just military service that sounded implausible to him. Then she added something that made everyone uncomfortable. She asked specifically if it was military service by someone who looked like her and her daughter. That he found hard to believe. The implication was clear and it hung in the air like smoke. Danny wanted to deny it immediately. He wanted to say that race had nothing to do with his decision. But as he stood there looking at Kenya's tear-stained face and remembering his own dismissive laughter, he could not be entirely certain that bias had not played a role. Maybe it had not been conscious, but that did not mean it had not been there. He had made assumptions about what was believable based on his own limited experience. He had seen a young black girl in worn clothing and decided her story was too fantastic to be true. He had not even taken the simple step of making a phone call to verify. That realization hit him harder than any of Maya's direct accusations. The truth was that he had failed at the most basic level of police work, and he could not say with absolute certainty that unconscious bias had not been part of that failure. Pete tried to interject something, but Maya held up her hand to silence him. She was not done with Danny yet. She told him that Kenya was a military kid who had spent most of her life moving from base to base. Kenya had been the new kid more times than Maya could count. She had dealt with people making assumptions about her because of how she looked, where she came from, and because her mom was in the service. Kenya had learned to be strong and to tell the truth even when it was hard. Maya's voice softened slightly as she explained this, but her eyes remained hard. Sergeant Palmer arrived at the mall 20 minutes after Maya and her group. He was accompanied by the mall's regional manager, a woman named Susan Clark who looked like she had been pulled away from something important and was not happy about it. Palmer took one look at the assembled group and Danny could see him processing the situation. Maya stood protectively near her daughter, flanked by 2 federal agents and a military officer. Kenya sat quietly with her belongings gathered around her. Pete hovered nervously in the background. Danny stood awkwardly to the side, feeling like a student called to the principal's office. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but several people remained, phones still recording. Palmer approached with his hands visible and his body language deliberately non-threatening. He introduced himself as Sergeant Palmer and immediately apologized to Maya for the situation. It was a smart opening move, Danny had to admit. Start with an acknowledgement of the problem and see if they could work toward a resolution. Maya acknowledged the apology with a slight nod, but her expression made it clear that sorry was not going to fix what had happened. Palmer asked her directly what she would like to see happen. It was a good question because it gave Maya control over the outcome and might prevent this from escalating further. Maya looked at Kenya, then back at Palmer. She said she wanted several things, and she listed them in order of importance. First, she wanted a formal apology to her daughter from everyone involved in detaining her. Second, she wanted assurance that officers would receive additional training on how to handle situations involving minors, particularly regarding verification of claims before detention. Third, she wanted a review of how the mall's security handled these incidents. Susan Clark jumped in immediately and said she could absolutely guarantee a full review. She started talking about security procedures and training protocols, but Maya interrupted her. She corrected Susan's use of her name, stating that it was Lieutenant Carter, not Ms. Carter. Susan apologized quickly and went quiet. Maya continued and said she was not finished with her list. Fourth, she wanted Kenya to understand that what happened was wrong. She wanted her daughter to know that the people who were supposed to protect her had failed to do their basic due diligence. But she also wanted Kenya to understand that most people in these positions were trying to do the right thing, even when they made mistakes. She looked directly at Danny as she said this last part. Then Maya asked Danny a question that he knew would determine how the rest of this played out. She asked if he believed he had made a mistake today. The question was simple, but Danny knew his answer mattered more than anything else he had said. He met her eyes, and it was one of the hardest things he had done in his 15-year career. He nodded and said yes, he had made a mistake. He should have verified Kenya's claims before forming conclusions. He should have listened to her instead of dismissing her. He looked at Kenya and told her he was sorry. Kenya looked up at him with an expression that was hard to read. She was quiet for a moment, then asked him a question that cut through all the complexity of the situation. She asked if he had not believed her because she was black. The question landed like a physical blow. The remaining crowd went absolutely silent. Palmer's eyes widened slightly. Susan Clark looked like she wanted to disappear. The 2 federal agents remained impassive, but Captain Rodriguez shifted her weight slightly, watching Danny carefully. Danny felt everyone's eyes on him and knew that his answer to this question would matter for the rest of his career. He also knew that Kenya deserved an honest response. He said that he did not think so. He hoped not, but he admitted that he could not say with absolute certainty that it had not affected his judgment, and that fact bothered him deeply. It was the most honest answer he could give, and it cost him something to say it out loud. Maya studied him for a long moment, and Danny forced himself to hold her gaze. Finally, she nodded slightly. She said that was more honest than most people would be willing to admit. Then she turned to Kenya and told her daughter that she wanted her to hear something. She explained that Officer Morrison had made a mistake today. He had judged the situation too quickly and let his assumptions guide him instead of facts. But he was also taking responsibility for it, and that mattered. Kenya nodded slowly, but her expression suggested she was not entirely satisfied with that explanation. She said quietly that she guessed she understood. Maya turned back to Palmer and told him she was not going to file a formal complaint. She said it was not because what happened was acceptable, but because she thought Officer Morrison was capable of learning from this experience. However, she made it clear that she trusted Palmer would use this as a training opportunity for the entire department. Palmer looked relieved and quickly assured her that they would absolutely use this case for training purposes. He promised that they would review their procedures for dealing with minors and ensure officers understood the importance of verification before detention. Susan Clark added that the mall would also be conducting a complete review of security procedures and would implement new training for all security staff. She said they would create clear protocols for verification before involving law enforcement. Maya listened to both of them and seemed to accept their assurances, though her expression remained serious. She told them that she expected to see actual changes, not just promises. She said she would be checking back in a few months to see what had been implemented. Palmer agreed readily, and Danny could tell his supervisor was grateful that Maya was willing to let this be resolved without formal complaints or media involvement, though the phone recordings meant it would probably end up online anyway. Agent Phillips stepped closer to Maya and quietly suggested they should probably wrap this up. Maya nodded and looked at Kenya. She asked her daughter if she was ready to go home. Kenya stood up, gathering her backpack and her tablet. She looked at all the adults who had been involved in detaining her, and Danny could see the mixture of emotions on her young face. After Palmer and Susan Clark left to begin their respective damage control efforts, Maya sat down on the bench next to her daughter. The two federal agents and Captain Rodriguez moved a respectful distance away, giving them space but remaining close enough to respond if needed. Danny had been preparing to leave and get back to his patrol car, but he found himself hesitating. There was something unfinished about this situation, and he did not want to walk away without understanding it better. Maya noticed him standing there and surprised him by gesturing to the bench across from where she and Kenya sat. She told him to sit because they should talk. Danny sat down, feeling very much like a student about to receive an important lesson. Maya leaned forward with her elbows on her knees and looked at him with an expression that was less angry now and more thoughtful. She said she was going to tell him something that might help him understand why she had reacted the way she did. She explained that Kenya was not just her daughter. Kenya was a military kid who had spent most of her life moving from base to base, installation to installation. She had been the new kid at school more times than Maya could count. Kenya had dealt with people making assumptions about her because of how she looked, where she came from, and because her mother was in the military and her father was not in the picture. Maya continued, saying that Kenya had learned to be strong and to stand up for herself. She had learned to tell the truth even when it was hard and even when people did not want to hear it. So when something like this happened, when Kenya did everything right and still got treated like a criminal, it undermined everything Maya had tried to teach her daughter about how the world worked. Danny absorbed this information and told Maya he understood. But Maya challenged him on that. She asked if he really understood. Then she explained further. She said she had commanded units in situations Danny could not imagine. She had made split-second decisions in zero gravity with hostile forces incoming. She had trained for years to reach her current position and had proven herself over and over again. But the hardest thing she had ever done, Maya said, was raise a black daughter in a world that would judge her before she opened her mouth. She gestured around the mall, indicating the suburban shopping center where this had all taken place. She said this place should be safe for Kenya. Her daughter should be able to carry a tablet that her mother bought without someone assuming she stole it. Kenya should be able to tell the truth about who her mother was without being laughed at. Those were basic things that Kenya should be able to expect, and yet they had all failed her today. Danny nodded slowly and repeated that she was right, and that he was sorry. Maya sat back and looked at him more carefully. She said she knew that military service seemed like something from another world to most people, especially something like orbital operations. Most civilians did not even know it existed, but that did not make it less real. Kenya knew exactly what Maya did because she had lived with the reality of it her entire life. When Kenya told someone about her mother's work, she was not making up stories. She was sharing her truth, her lived experience. Kenya spoke up quietly, adding details that made her mother's work more real. She said her mom had to wear a special suit that cost more than their house. She explained that Maya jumped out of ships in orbit and fell to Earth on purpose. She had done it 43 times. Maya smiled at her daughter and gently corrected her. She said it was actually 44 times because Kenya had forgotten to count the training drop from the previous month. Kenya argued that training drops did not count, and Maya conceded the point with a small laugh. It was the first moment of lightness Danny had seen between them, and it reminded him that beneath all of this they were just a mother and daughter who cared about each other. Maya looked back at Danny and explained more about her work. She said the Earth Defense Coalition had been formed 15 years ago, after what was vaguely referred to as the First Contact Incident. Most of the details were still classified, but the basic facts were public record. The EDC maintained a defensive perimeter around Earth and provided rapid response capability. Maya was part of a unit that deployed from orbit when ground forces could not respond quickly enough. Danny absorbed this information and realized how little he knew about what was happening beyond his daily routine. He admitted that he had heard rumors of military expansion into space but had not paid much attention. It seemed so far removed from his day-to-day life as a suburban police officer. Maya nodded and said that most people did not know much about it. The work was not advertised or publicly discussed in detail. But she emphasized that this was not an excuse for dismissing Kenya when she tried to tell the truth. The lack of public knowledge about the EDC did not make Kenya's statements any less valid. Danny agreed and said he should have verified instead of assuming. Maya watched him carefully and seemed to be evaluating whether he truly understood the lesson here. She asked him what he would do differently if this situation happened again. Danny thought about it carefully before answering. He said he would take the time to verify claims before making judgments. He would remember that his assumptions about what was possible might be limited by his own experience. He would listen to people, especially young people, with more openness and less skepticism. Most importantly, he would check his own biases and think about whether his judgments were being influenced by factors that should not matter. Maya seemed satisfied with this answer. She told him that was a good start. Then she added something that stuck with Danny. She said that people in positions of authority, whether police officers or security guards or teachers, had a responsibility to do better. When someone, especially a child, came to them for help or tried to tell them something important, they needed to listen first and judge later. The power imbalance meant that mistakes fell much harder on the person without authority. An hour after Maya arrived, Danny stood in the mall parking lot watching as she and Kenya walked toward a black SUV. Captain Rodriguez and the federal agents had already left in separate vehicles. The evening sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, and Danny felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. This had been one of the most difficult afternoons of his career, and he knew it would stay with him for a long time. Palmer came up beside him and observed that the situation could have gone worse. There was relief in his supervisor's voice, but also an undertone that suggested Danny was not off the hook completely. Danny shook his head and said he was not sure how it could have gone worse. He felt like he had made them all look like fools. Palmer pointed out that Danny had made a judgment call that turned out to be wrong, and that it happened to everyone eventually. But then he added something that made Danny wince. He said Maya had been right about verification being basic police work. Danny should have checked before forming his conclusions. Danny acknowledged this and said he knew he had made a mistake. Palmer was quiet for a moment, then told Danny that this incident was definitely going into the training manual by next week. He said future officers would learn about the time Officer Morrison laughed at a kid whose mother really was in Special Forces. The way he said it made it clear this was going to follow Danny for the rest of his career, at least within the department. Danny groaned but accepted it. He deserved to be the cautionary tale. Palmer clapped him on the shoulder and said that learning from mistakes was all anyone could do. He added that for what it was worth, Danny had handled the aftermath well by owning his error and being honest about his uncertainty regarding bias. That kind of honesty was rare and valuable, even if it was uncomfortable. Palmer walked away to his own vehicle, leaving Danny alone with his thoughts. He watched as Kenya suddenly stopped walking and said something to her mother. Maya nodded, and Kenya turned around and jogged back across the parking lot toward Danny. Danny watched the girl approach and wondered what she wanted to say. Kenya reached him and looked up with a serious expression that reminded him strongly of her mother. She called him Officer Morrison in a formal tone that sounded strange coming from someone so young. Danny looked down at her and acknowledged her. Kenya said that her mom told her people made mistakes and what mattered was what they did afterward. She said Maya also told her that Danny seemed like someone who wanted to do better. The words coming from a 12-year-old carried surprising weight. Danny felt a lump forming in his throat but managed to tell Kenya that he did want to do better. He meant it with everything in him. Kenya nodded seriously and said that in that case she accepted his apology. But then she added something with a slight edge to her voice. She said he should probably learn more about what the EDC did, because there were other kids like her out there. If he laughed at them too, her mom would not be the only person he would have to deal with. Despite everything that had happened, Danny found himself smiling at her directness. He told her that was fair and he would definitely educate himself better. Then he asked if he could ask her a question. Kenya agreed. Danny asked what it was like having a mother who jumped from space. Kenya's entire demeanor changed as her face lit up in a way it had not all afternoon. She told him it was amazing. She talked about how her mom had all these incredible stories about seeing Earth from orbit, about the different space stations, about the other operators she worked with. Sometimes it was scary, Kenya admitted, because she knew the work was dangerous. But mostly it was just cool because her mom was the strongest person she knew. Danny listened and told her he believed it. Then he added that he was genuinely sorry he had not believed Kenya earlier. He told her she deserved better treatment than what she received. Kenya looked at him steadily and agreed that she did deserve better. But then she thanked him for saying so. She stuck out her hand in a surprisingly adult gesture. Danny shook her hand, struck by the confidence in her grip. Kenya turned and ran back to where her mother waited by the SUV. Maya gave Danny a final nod of acknowledgement before getting into the vehicle with her daughter. Danny watched them drive away and then climbed into his own patrol car. As he drove back to the station, he thought about assumptions and truth, about the stories people told and the ones others chose to believe. He thought about a 12-year-old girl who knew exactly who her mother was and tried to share that truth, only to be met with laughter and disbelief. He thought about the lesson he had learned the hard way, that the world was bigger and stranger than his daily routine suggested. He realized that his view of what was possible had been too narrow, shaped by his limited experience rather than by curiosity or openness. The encounter had forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about his own biases and assumptions. When he got home that night, Danny did something he had not done in years. He spent several hours researching the Earth Defense Coalition. He found Maya Carter's name in a commendation list for distinguished service during something referred to only as the Titan Station incident. The details remained classified, but the recognition was clearly real and significant. He read about orbital deployment operations, about the training requirements, about the missions that could be discussed publicly. He learned that what Kenya had told him was not only true but understated. The work her mother did was even more impressive and dangerous than he had realized. Danny made a promise to himself that night as he closed his laptop. The next time someone told him something that seemed impossible or unlikely, he would do them the courtesy of verifying it before dismissing them. He would check his assumptions and ask himself if bias was influencing his judgment. He would remember that his experience was not the limit of what was real in the world. It seemed like a small commitment, but he knew it was important. If he could carry that lesson forward, then maybe some good could come from this difficult day. Somewhere across town, Maya Carter was tucking her daughter into bed. She reminded Kenya that being right did not always feel good, but standing up for the truth always mattered. She told her daughter that people could make mistakes and still deserve second chances. The important thing was whether they learned and grew from those mistakes. Kenya listened to her mother and thought about orbital drops and police officers, and the complicated truth that the world was not always fair, but that did not mean you stopped telling the truth. She thought about how Danny had eventually listened and admitted his mistake. That counted for something, even if it had taken too long to happen. The tablet sat on Kenya's desk, charged and ready for school the next day, exactly where it had always belonged. Kenya drifted off to sleep thinking about her mother's stories of Earth seen from space, about the vast darkness beyond their atmosphere, and about the work that happened up there to keep everyone safe down here. She thought about how someday she might tell her own stories, and she hoped people would listen,